goddamn military. And I'm fucking livid that we are stuck in the timeline where Alex Jones is right. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of O'Donnell for Liberty. As always, I'm Justin, your host for today and forever. First thing, shout out to our sponsored swag store over at swagstore.com. You guys can head over, links in the description, get all your favorite Liberty swag. Highlight today, a classic I Survived COVID-19 '84, Make Orwell Fiction Again shirt. Personal, my favorite and top seller on the site. So head on over there. Again, SwagStore.com and get all your favorite swag today. Now, I want to give a big welcome to our next guest, our guest for today, Vice Chair of the Libertarian Party of Maine, and heading up some of the most efficient activism in the Libertarian Party. Too many people in the Libertarian Party think activism counts as sending mean tweets, pissing people off on the internet, and not actually doing much. But Harrison's actually been taking his position in the Libertarian Party seriously and getting not just on the ground in the public, but into the state house to actually push liberty forward in the state of Maine. So give a big warm welcome to Harrison Kemp. Harrison, thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Justin. It was cool to finally get to meet you at PorcFest.
You get to meet everybody at PorcFest. It's always sometimes the good and the bad about PorcFest is you meet people you've never met, and sometimes you don't recognize people you did meet last year. But we have a running joke with PorcFest at this point, like 7 years in for me, where PorcFest is one big trip, and the rest of the year you're just recovering for it. But when you show back up, conversations just kind of pick up where they left off 50 weeks ago. So like the 2 weeks of PorcFest and ForkFest is really where everyone that's where your family gets together. A lot of people just don't keep in touch throughout the year, but you recognize somebody you met 3 years ago and the conversation just picks right up where it left off. It's a fantastic place for liberty, fantastic place to meet other libertarians.
Yeah, I had a great time. It was my first year getting to go, so I was
you're not even
excited.
That far.
No, well, see, a few years ago I wanted to go and I just couldn't get the time off work, couldn't afford it. And then the next year it was kind of the same story. Then COVID hit. And then this was the first year I was both, free enough to go, had the money to go, and there was a big event going on. So I was so ecstatic to finally get there.
You're only what? Like I'm a 2.5 hour drive. You're not even much further than I am, or even closer.
Yeah, I'm about 3.5. Yeah, so it's a nice trip. No excuse from here on. No, you will see me there next year for sure.
All right. Well, how long have you been involved in the Libertarian Party in Maine?
I have been involved up here since the end of 2019-ish, going into early 2020. Before that, I was, an agorist. I was a voluntarist. I was just doing my little blog and podcast that nobody cared about. I wasn't helping anyone. I wasn't making a difference. I wasn't convincing anybody. And then I kind of got tired of it, and I felt like I was just running in circles. And so that's when I decided there's another way. There's something else I can do that will take these things that I've been really studying and diving into and getting a really deep understanding of, but put them into practice so that I can affect people's lives in a positive way.
And you jumped feet first. I mean, that's not really uncommon in the Libertarian Party, but like, you joined in end of 2019, and here you are already in party leadership. It's not even been like a full 2-year election cycle.
Yeah, it was. I was in the party for about 6 months before I became vice chair. And the reason was just I showed the ability to organize people and give some purpose, some motivation, some direction. And it was through legislation. Before I came around, there was nobody in the party up here that was writing legislation, that was lobbying legislation. The whole goal was just trying to regain party status and be accepted by the state enough to be on the ballot. Well,
which is not an unimportant goal.
No, it's definitely not, but we did not have the infrastructure in place to do it. So for us, it was just a challenge that we weren't ready for. So we kind of switched gears and really focused on our legislative acts, because right before I became vice chair, we had actually gotten 2 sponsors for our ban on no-knock raids. And so that kind of laid the groundwork for moving over from the registration drive to legislation. And then from legislation, we candidates and getting candidates out and about before we get our permanent status. So that way people are used to the name Libertarian. They've seen us around, they know what we're about. So when we do go do our registration drives, kind of coinciding with our candidates, it makes it a lot easier to pick up both goals, because they're all important. It's just which one do you have the infrastructure in place for within your state is the question of what you go after first.
Well, and I've started kind of raising the question here in New Hampshire. I mean, we keep running at the same wall. We keep fighting for ballot access. We get ballot access. A few years later, we lose ballot access. We start fighting for ballot access again. What good is being on the ballot if we don't have a record to show people of what we're doing and what we've accomplished?
Right.
So,
yeah. And like here in Maine, I'm sure New Hampshire is pretty similar, but if you are not a recognized party, you can run and then put any 3 words on the ballot you want. So you can pick Libertarian of Maine or Libertarian Party and put that on the ballot. And even though we're not a registered party, a qualified party, whatever legal term they want to use that day, we get the same goal. So I think that's an important thing to look at. And, you know, if someone like New Hampshire, like you guys are having an issue with ballot access, maybe switch it up. And for the next session, worry about legislation, worry about local candidates, worry about putting those yard signs out and really getting the brand out there.
Well, I mean, it is a little bit different in New Hampshire. When it comes to ballot access, we do have a party column ballot. So if we don't petition to get the Libertarian Party recognized, the ballot is just listed as all Republican candidates, all Democrat candidates, and all other candidates. You don't get to put any designation beyond other. And so on the random years where we have like a Justice, Democrat, Progressive, Socialist running on the top of the ticket, if we don't petition otherwise, they'll just list us in with them and make it look like we're the same party. And then they'll have a bunch of Socialist Party money behind advertising that all the other candidates are commies. And that backfired real bad once. But on the flip side, last time we had major party status, last time we had ballot access, the Secretary of State was too lazy to design a new ballot. So they put out the same 3-column ballot, and it just said Republicans, Democrats, Libertarians, and other candidates. And they still put us in the same column as other candidates.
Wow.
They just called that column Libertarians and other candidates.
Which is almost more confusing for your voters, you know. That's a rough system. You know,
it is. And
move to Maine, we've got a better system.
Well, on the flip side of that, our legislature is the most accessible in the world. Like you're talking about working with legislation and putting in legislation. We have over 400 state reps. I have like 30 different state reps' cell phone numbers I can text at any time because our average legislative district is about 1,200 people.
That's small. That's awesome.
Right. It's not uncommon for a state rep to have literally shaken hands with everyone in their district while campaigning.
That's pretty neat. I mean, Maine has 153 divided by 1.3 million people, something like that, 1.1 million people. So we have on average like 5,000, 6,000, which isn't too bad. Some of our areas, though, it takes a lot of land to cover 6,000 people. So
Southern's got a question. With the FSP gaining so much attention this year and the discussions around it, what are both of your thoughts on a FSP in every state thing?
So I guess as the outsider, I'll answer that first.
Sure.
I like the idea of the Free State Project. I think that it only makes sense if you do it in a few states at most. If you try to enact it throughout every state, you're basically just putting in another libertarian party. That's really all you would be doing, just without the same political mindset. So I think that if you're going to have a Free State Project, maybe 5 states at most could have something similar to that. That way you don't have to move all the way from California to New Hampshire. You can move from California to Idaho, you know, something like that. But even at that, I think it kind of dilutes the whole idea behind concentrating our forces in one state and using that to take it over. So
Yeah, I think that's the point. Is it dilutes the purpose of the Free State Project to have it in even more than one state. If the whole purpose is to try and get all the libertarians to move to one spot where they can have the most effect, then all of a sudden picking multiple spots, now you're diluting any any chance you have at that attempt. And I know Southern, he's a great guy. He's a local here in New Hampshire. He's not a Free Stater. I'm not a Free Stater. Turns out we hang out with all the Free Staters because, well, when you agree with people, you agree with them. But it comes down to I've always been kind of on the outside looking in at the Free State Project as an idea of saying, aren't we just giving up? Are at that point, aren't we saying that we're never going to be the majority? We're never going to be able to convince people where we are, so we're just kind of running away to go all hide together and force our little libertarian utopia and let everyone else rot? And to me, that's the antithesis of what the Libertarian Party stands for, which is a world set free in our lifetime. I'm an anarchist. I don't believe in borders. I don't believe that we should let the state dictate where freedom is allowed and where freedom isn't. And I've gotten into arguments with a few Free Staters here in New Hampshire when I've been showing support for the revolution stand up in Cuba and the things that happened in Venezuela where people started fighting for their own freedom. And they're like, oh, that's not our concern. I'm like, how isn't it? How isn't human freedom our concern? And people come back, well, because it's not in New Hampshire. And all the Free State Project to me has done is created a kind of a new nationalism. It's just a smaller nationalism. And that's fine. I would take the balkanization of North America as a step forward, but I don't think it's a sustainable step forward towards the true goal of human freedom.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I do what I do within the Libertarian Party and writing legislation and lobbying legislation, is because there's a lot of people who agree with libertarian positions but hate libertarian ideas. And that's a lot of it is because they've never actually heard the libertarian idea. They've read some article from some guy at HuffPo who was trying to discredit libertarians, but they've never actually looked into it. And so what I find is if we can just give people more freedom, then they start to realize on their own that, hey, we've had this freedom thing happening. The government's got less intrusive. The police has been, curtailed a little bit on what they're allowed to do. And life's pretty good. So if we can just kind of start that conversation, that's the first step.
Well, and that really is the point of legislative activism. That's the point of actually doing things within the legislative process. The Libertarian Party keeps running candidates against a wall, and more often than not, when you go and look at the materials and the website for whatever libertarian candidate that's asking you for money and asking you for support in their campaign, it's a whole bunch of here are the problems. It's not a whole lot of here are the solutions and here's what we're going to do when we get elected. Or if it is, it's a whole lot of pie in the sky, like end the Fed. Okay, how are you going to end the Fed as one rep? What coalition are you building? What are the reasonable, practical, and attainable goals that we can actually go after to advance liberty and advance freedom in our lifetimes? And that's the crux of what your work has been. The ban on no-knock raids is phenomenal. Like, what was the process of actually getting that into the State House for you?
Yeah, so I had started off and I wrote 7 different bills, and there was everything from Second Amendment protection, Fourth Amendment protection. We have these crazy vaccine rules for children when they go to school. They are mandated to have all kinds of vaccines. There's no choice. So I had a bill to get rid of that. And no-knock raids was just one of the ones I had written up. And then I started meeting with people within the Libertarian Party and meeting other activists. And they ended up connecting me with a gentleman who connected me to my first rep. She was a Democrat. She was running for her first term, and she needed something that she could kind of make her calling cry and make her war cry, if you will. So she made it no knocks. And then we ended up getting a Ron Paul Republican to join on board, a guy who's actually, ironically, was a Republican legislator, but a member of the LP. And so if that tells you how he votes, So he ended up coming on board and being our second sponsor. So we had bipartisan support. And then I wrote them each different bills. We amended the bill so that way when it went to the meeting to I'm blanking on the word, but when it went to the committee, they actually had to debate it twice. So there was no 10-minute discussion on it. It was like a 4-hour discussion between both bills. And then they ended up, before the vote, converting into one bill. And then it passed the committee unanimously, and it was signed into law in July or June of sometime, at the end of June.
Yeah, and so it wasn't that hard. It was a matter of just asking questions and meeting people and getting your ideas in front of them.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of other little steps in there, like contacting police chiefs and sheriffs and explaining it to them and having them explain their positions to us. There was a lot of, checking the existing laws to make sure that what we were doing was within the framework of, all right, we're actually repealing this law that we're trying to, So there was a lot of little steps in there, collecting surveys of folks who wanted to help support it by calling their legislators and whatnot. So yeah, there was a lot of little steps in there. And in addition to this, because I found that I'm one of the few people within the party who does this, and I love teaching. So if anyone out there is listening and you want to have some kind of a class on this for your state, just shoot me an email, heliosnationalconsulting@gmail.com. I'd love to come in and I'll give a breakdown to your states. So
awesome. And I mean, to your point about at least one Republican in Maine that is a member of the LP, even though he was a sitting Republican office holder, you're in New Hampshire, and being a dues-paying member isn't really the litmus test you have to have. But I can think of 3 off the top of my head without even looking at the member rolls of who are sitting state legislators while continuing to be dues-paying members of the LP, even though they're sitting as Republican or Democrats. And here in New Hampshire, we've seen it in both parties because it's a little bit more unique. People get elected on a budget of $100 as long as they run under a major party and don't have to pay for ballot access. And it's a part-time legislature, and it's a more accessible legislature. The Free State Project likes to brag that I think there's like 40-something free staters in the state house at any given time. And those are all people who moved for a libertarian utopia. So if you're watching from New Hampshire, it's not like your legislators are inaccessible. If you want to get introduced to your legislator or a friendly Liberty legislator, just hit me up on Twitter and I'll do it. Half of them follow me on Twitter too. It's not that hard to get your ideas in front of the legislature. And if you're in a state that's a little bit more tyrannical at heart, like Massachusetts or New York, where legislators consider themselves to be a higher class of people and don't like to talk to people, well, then you have ballot referendums and you have a way to go around the state legislature. One of the incredible things about Maine that we haven't brought up, and I didn't even consider it till it just occurred to me, you guys have a citizen's veto.
Yes, we do.
And it's not difficult to exercise.
It's so easy to do that I wrote my own, and we're working on it now. It's so we actually started a citizens initiative to make it so that the governor can never lock us down, never implement a lot of the things that they're currently allowed to do. They can make it so alcohol and explosives are illegal, so that it's illegal to buy weapons. There's all kinds of things that they're allowed to do. Conscription. So we just went through the bill that currently exists, the law, and started repealing stuff. Started changing one letter at a time, one word at a time. And you'd be amazed how much you can change a bill or a law just by adding in the word "not." Like there are sections where it says the governor may conscript people in the aid, and we just say may not. 3 letters, and you just change the law a lot.
And made it like more protection of the people and like stripping the government's powers away. And we always like to say, as anarchists and libertarians, there's no such thing as a good law, but in reality is like you have these laws that do nothing but restrict the government. And at its heart, that's not necessarily a law as much as it is a restriction. Right.
It's a restriction. It's a nullification. It's a line in the sand. And that's really kind of what our no-knock bill was. It was a line in the sand saying, look, the government's done all this craziness this last year. We are going to put our foot down and say, if you want to come into our homes, you have to knock first. This is the one thing we can do right now. And at the time, we didn't really have the ability. We hadn't done the research enough yet, and we didn't have enough of a network to start doing anything along the lines of the Citizens Initiative. And we had a couple of bills get put up this year that were supposed to do what the initiative did, and they all failed in committee, unfortunately. So When you have a Democrat stronghold and a Democrat governor, it's very hard to get the Democrats to say that the governor is no longer allowed to do what she's doing. So,
well, oddly enough, we had the opposite problem here in New Hampshire. The Libertarian state reps in whatever party they happen to be seated in, but the ones endorsed by the New Hampshire Liberty Alliance and the Free State Project members drafted a series of legislation to prohibit a lockdown, to ban mask mandates, to ban vaccine passports, and to strip a whole bunch of powers away from the governor. And the governor signed them. Like,
interesting.
Right. When you make it known enough and you show enough popular support for stripping away the powers of the governor's like, fuck, I don't want to have this fight.
Right.
Especially when he's trying to set himself up to run for Senate.
Yeah. Yeah. Like for us, because we're starting to find candidates, we're starting to look for someone to run for governor. And we have 31 bills already, just basic ideas of bills that we're going to work on. So everything from, legalized nature to defend the guard to lowering property taxes to lowering spending to being able to hunt on your friend's property on Sunday with written permission, which ironically, right now you're allowed to hunt on your own land on Sundays, but you're not allowed to go onto your friend's land to hunt on Sundays. So it's like this weird rule. You can't go onto someone's land who says, yes, you're allowed to hunt here because it's Sunday. It's just a silly loophole in the law that needs to be fixed.
Man, even Massachusetts lets you do that.
Yeah, and it's something that affects a lot of people because a lot of folks only have 2 days a week to go hunt. And if you're someone who uses hunting season to stock your fridge, then, having half the amount of time to go hunt is a real detriment. So we've got 31 different bills so far that we're working on. And the idea behind all of them is to tell the government no. It's not to impose restrictions on people. It's to impose restrictions on the government. And I know right now, because I can hear my old self yelling at me, like, you can't use the government to stop the government, which there is merit to that argument. But in certain aspects, you can use the government to limit the government, because if you can get enough popular support behind an idea, then the government has no real choice because they know they're going to get elected out. And especially if we're making it campaign issues, if our candidates are campaigning on ending the wars, on ending the drug laws, on ending stupid things like our red light cameras and seatbelt laws, then you can actually start to get some still popular people, like some real popular Mainers, locals, coming out in support of your ideas. And when you get that, it's kind of over with, because that's who all the Republicans and Democrats get their money from, is the well-known business owners.
I mean, I get your point. It is really hard to overcome the philosophical spoonerism, where it's like, oh, we're going to draft a law to stop the government. It's like, okay, but like, we have a constitution that hasn't done much.
And I love Spooner. I love Spooner so much that he plays a very vital role at the very ending of my first book. He made his way in there. So I love Spooner.
It's, I mean, he's so
I agree with him. And that's kind of the issue with anarchist. I'm a philosophical anarchist. I want to have a system of no rulers, no borders, peaceful interaction on the market. But we're so far away from that right now that if I just sit here with my couple of friends who agree with me, the government's just going to come in and stormroll us over anyway. So we've got to do any little bit that we can.
So, I mean, what are the extents of the citizens' power with the citizen referendum and citizen veto in Maine? I'm not a Maine citizen. I'm not familiar with it. I'm just thinking of a situation like in South Dakota, where you have Kristi Noem as the governor, who everyone heralds as a libertarian governor, even though, in my opinion, she's a piece of shit, who, as the chief executive of the state and as the governor of the state, used taxpayer money to sue herself to delay implementing a law that was passed by citizen referendum. There was a citizen referendum in South Dakota to legalize cannabis, and it passed overwhelmingly. And Kristi Noem, the Republican governor, said, oh, no, we can't have cannabis. It's a gateway drug. And she used taxpayer money to sue herself in her capacity as governor to prevent it from being implemented.
Yeah, so we up here, we actually had a citizens initiative a couple of years ago that passed with overwhelming support signature-wise, went to the ballot, passed, and then the government said, no, that's unconstitutional. You're trying to change or create a constitutional amendment, and you can't do that. Well, the only reason it was an issue is because that bill that they were putting up was going to take away power from the government. Had it been giving them more authority, we all know they would have just looked past it and signed it into law. So it is one of those unfortunate scenarios where they have lawyer after lawyer comb through it and look, and if you did one comma wrong or you misspelled one word or put an extra space in, they
won't tell you beforehand. They're going to wait till after you already do all the effort and spend all the money.
Correct. And because I had even, when I put this in, my initiative in, I even asked the lady, I was like, hey, so can you guys just do a quick check, make sure that I did this right? And she's like, oh, we're not allowed to. So you're not allowed to help the citizens. You're just going to let us do all the work. And then you're going to come in and say, no, you're not allowed to do that. So that's why it is so important to get people into government, because we can change those little rules like that. We can implement some kind of policy where they have to go through and do a review beforehand rather than afterward.
The disparity in process is so mind-blowing as well. Like I've been active in Massachusetts and New Hampshire in my adult life in the political process, and I've always been aware of Maine because every once in a while there's a big push and they'll hire petitioners to come to Maine. Oh, it's a 30-minute drive for me to go to make a couple $100 collecting signatures. Why the hell not? But in Massachusetts, they have like a 2-stage referendum. Like you have to collect signatures for your petition referendum. Then once you collect enough, the Supreme Court will review it to tell you whether or not it's constitutional. Then you can collect more to put it on the ballot.
Weird.
Yeah. Here in New Hampshire, we can't do anything. We cannot petition a question onto the ballot in any shape, form whatsoever. However, a constitutional amendment must go to the ballot. The State House cannot change the Constitution without putting it on the ballot for people to decide. And they're obligated to, if the legislature goes 10 years in New Hampshire without amending the Constitution in one form or another, they are obligated to call a constitutional convention to allow the people to amend it.
Wow. That is very interesting. That is a lot different than what we have up here.
Right, but in Maine, you guys can veto like a bill that passes. You can then collect signatures to just repeal the bill.
Correct. Yep. And actually, one of the bills that we're working on for next session is to make that process even easier, so that if the governor decides to veto something, so let's just say the governor decides to veto something, right? This is actually a loophole in the law right now. There is no ability for towns, municipalities, individuals to basically veto a governor's veto. So if the governor says, no, I don't agree with this initiative, then I want to put in a law that says cities, towns, and municipalities are allowed to veto the governor's veto and institute that rule within their own cities, within their own municipalities. And then in addition to that, we're going to make it so that if the governor signs a law in, all we would need is 1,000 signatures to be able to get that on the ballot for repeal. And it would go on a special election ballot within 90 days. So it doesn't go into effect, so that way before it's even really in effect, we have already started the process of getting it off the ballot. And it's not a perfect system, but it's a lot better than the one we have now. And it's, it's on the stepping stone to perfection, you could say.
Right. And I mean, I'm sure all this is made easier with John Andrews in the State House, because you guys have a Libertarian state rep in the State House as a member of the party. Like, how much of this do you have to flow through him, or do you have a whole caucus of state reps that you've built connections with that you can put stuff through, not necessarily rely on him?
So it's both. John Andrews is a great resource. Having a libertarian in office is amazing. And he is always happy to sponsor, co-sponsor, help find other sponsors for bills that we're putting up. And if there's, it doesn't happen, hasn't yet, but if it ever does happen that, we have a bill we want to put up that he doesn't agree with, he's not going to go out and slam us in the media or anything like that. It's just, we disagree on an issue, on some technicality. He'll help us fix it and whatnot. And so
now, Have you seen maybe his effectiveness as a rep decline since he's publicly joined the Libertarian Party, or like any of the I mean, I guess that's a lot of behind the scenes stuff. I just remember I worked very closely with the 3 state reps we had in New Hampshire when they were in the state house. And all of them one started as a Democrat, 2 started as Republicans, and switched parties very early in their term. And we noticed immediately, all of a sudden, they had no influence whatsoever. Where like the Speaker of the House would come to committee meetings just to sign in against whatever bill that they were doing, wouldn't even speak, but it's just when the Speaker of the House and the both majority and minority leader come in and just sign a thing saying kill this, it gets killed.
Right.
Yeah. And it would be stuff like they would resubmit bills that were like, there was a Republican partisan bill from the session before that didn't pass because the Republicans were in the minority, but it was a very libertarian bill, and a libertarian resubmitted it and the Republicans voted against it.
Really?
Yeah.
So yeah, up here what we have, basically John Andrews, ever since he's became a member of the LP and working on the LP ticket, he has actually gone through the whole legislative session. You know, he was elected as a Republican, but very quickly before any bills started getting passed or serious bills started hitting committee, he was already a libertarian. And since then, he's gotten quite a few bills passed. He's, you know, been to speak to some very important bills like Defend the Guard. He actually was not too far after Scott Horton in their testimonies on that one. So that was pretty neat. And he's just been a wrecking ball in there. You know, he actually got kicked off of several subcommittees, or all the subcommittees he was on, because he refused to wear a mask. Yeah, after the mandates had been lifted. So, and it's funny too, this shows you the difference between a libertarian and a Republican who claims to be a libertarian. So John Andrews showed up with a few of the Republicans that he used to work with and friends of his to work. None of them wearing masks. They all got taken off their subcommittees. But the next day, the only one to go back to work not wearing a mask was John Andrews. Everybody else did it because the media was there. They got some publicity, and then they got their slap on the wrist and they tucked their tail between their legs and went and cowered. John Andrews showed up the next day and he's like, I'm going to work. I got stuff to do. So it's just the resolve. You can see it very clearly. And that's the difference, is that he's not afraid to take on the real fights. And that's what we as libertarians are here to do, is take on the real fights. And there are some fights that come up that we look at and we go, God, I wish we had the resources to really do something about that. And it's unfortunate because sometimes, you know, there's like a lady recently who lost her business license because she was providing quote unquote illegal tint. And it was a couple of degrees darker than the state allows, but it was nowhere near as dark as what the state police drive around in, mind you. And so she lost her business license. That's how she feeds her kids, takes care of her family. And I wish we had more of an infrastructure in place to help people like that, because she's a victim of a victimless crime. You know, she is the only victim in that crime right now. But, you know, that's one of the bills that we're going to put in next session, is to get rid of that so that people like her don't have to go through that ever again. And it's the political process is a very slow one. You know, it's nowhere near the same as being in an agorist society with the same few hundred or thousand people who you guys all take care of each other. And then it just kind of, that's the way it is.
New Hampshire's a special place.
Yeah. So I would say my recommendation to anyone who ever wants to get into the political process is understand that it's not the only answer. You know, it's not a one-stop shop of, oh, I'm just going to do the political thing, and then I can call myself like a good libertarian or a good activist. Because what I found is that you want to have a really decent philosophical background, a really good understanding of economics, of history, of all the moving parts that go into different bills, different legislation. And that way, when you actually have to explain your positions to people, it's a lot more than a bumper sticker. You know, you have a real understanding that you can convey in a couple of quick sentences. And that's kind of the reason I wrote this last book that I just finished. It'll be coming out very soon, by the end of the month. It's called Closing Freedom. It's all about how libertarian activists should be talking to new members, should be talking to new donors, to their families, to somebody they meet on the street while they're petitioning or doing phone banking or sending out emails. So it's over 150 pages of just, here are different word tracks. Here are different things that I've used that work. Because I have a sales background. And so I've just taken everything from my sales experience, and then I combined that with my understanding of the Libertarian Party, of our movement, of the philosophy and the economics and the history. And it kind of culminates into one very easy outreach tool.
I mean, I feel like we definitely need more people with a sales background in the liberty movement. That's one of our biggest problems, is when you start seeing candidates year after year after year, you're like, Jesus Christ, do we have anybody who's not a software engineer? And it's all people who think logically and think by numbers, and all they know how to do is communicate numbers and logic, but they don't actually have the sales background needed to understand that people react emotionally. They don't give two shits about your logic. If you can't explain to them how it's going to help them and how it's going to benefit them on their level, then they're not going to hear what you have to say. And
yeah.
I think that's a big thing that we need to start actually focusing on. Isn't necessarily like policy training, it's sales training, teaching people how to talk to each other. I've run for U.S. Senate, I've run for U.S. Congress, I've been on TV a dozen times doing interviews about those, and I have, like, in my gut, I know that I've reached more people while petitioning and having conversations as when asking them to sign a petition than I have during televised interviews. Because a televised interview, you listen there, was like, all right, we got 7 minutes to cram in a whole platform, and he's going to ask me questions he wants four-word answers to. And all the televised interviews do is, if we don't have the reach where people know who we are to begin with, it's just reinforcing existing support. But it's actually getting out and talking to people and figuring out what their problems are and how you can address their problems that we actually accomplish the goal of converting people over to those ideas. And so I think that's phenomenal. I think my background is sales training, and I did something very similar a few years ago when I first got involved, was write my book, Selling Liberty. And we need more people like me, like you, like Larry Sharp, like Spike Cohen, who can actually talk to people about those things and about what you're actually doing. Because nobody wants to hear you say, we're going to solve all of our problems by ending the income tax. They want to hear about how your specific proposal to end no-knock raids is going to make them safer.
Right. And it comes down to really trying to find out what is important to these people's lives. Whoever you're talking to, they are the most important person in the world while you're talking to them, because they're the only person who you're going to convince at that time. You're not going to convince the guy you talked to in a half hour at this moment. You're only going to convince this person. And if you think ahead too far and you're like playing out a whole conversation in your mind and you're waiting to get certain objections and things, then you're not listening to your conversation partner. You are ready to talk to them, talk at them. You're not ready to help them with anything. And as Jackie Cooper always said, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So
right.
That's why whenever I meet someone, my first question to them is, what is your most important issue when you go into the ballot box? What affects how you vote the most? And then we start talking from there. They'll say gun rights or abortion rights or GSM rights or whatever it may be. And then I can just have a conversation with them. And usually I start off by going, yeah, isn't it crazy what the government's trying to do around that? Like, isn't it crazy that, the government has the right to say to somebody, oh, you're not a person, you don't get to marry who you love, and everybody gets that. So you really want to just try and dig in and find out what is important to this person, and then explain your philosophy, explain your candidates or your position. And that's usually
absolutely
the easiest. Oh, yeah. And I never, also too, I would never ask somebody, what would your position on this be? Right away. That's never the first question. It's like, what's your position on gun rights? Because then there's a wrong answer. You want to give people the first question, put them at ease, where there's no pressure. Nobody's afraid to tell you that gun rights or taxes or whatever it may be is their most important issue.
Right. And it all boils down to asking questions. I used to tell people when I'd first hire them and do sales training with them, I want you to ask more questions than answering. because you're not selling something if you're not actually identifying what the need is. So the best way to approach a conversation is to ask as many questions as you can, but make sure you ask the right questions, because nobody's going to give a shit what you have to say if they think you're listening but you're not hearing. So
right. And it's not like, also too, I remember when I first got in, I met a guy who'd been around for 20 years. It was a piece of furniture at that point. And he would say things like, if you can just get the customer to say yes a lot, then you're going to trick them. And at the end of the meeting, you're going to ask them, oh, do you want to buy this car? And they're automatically going to be like, yeah, because that's what they've trained their brain to do. And I was like, it took me about a month or two to figure it out, but that's not what's happening. When you get someone to say yes a lot, all you're doing is confirming you're on the right track. You're not tricking them. So, is this the right color? Yes. Does the seat feel comfortable? Yes. Okay, good. Because if it doesn't, this is the wrong car for you. There's no way I would want to sell you this car if you don't like the color of the seat. So, and you want to do that with libertarianism. Be like, hey, how do you feel about lowering taxes? How do you feel about having more control over your kid's school? About, lowering, I don't know. Do you guys have inspections and vehicle registration and whatnot in New Hampshire?
It's the most goddamn tyrannical form of government we have. Fucking swear to God. It's every year, and it's arbitrary and subjective. There aren't actually standards.
See, and when I say to somebody like, how do you feel about having to pay $300 a year to register your 10-year-old car? They're like, oh, it's fucking stupid. Right. And so I don't have to get into these things about like, are you a conservative? Are you a liberal, progressive? Just talk to them about the issue.
Yeah. All right. So moving forward, next year, next legislative cycle, if you had to pick one proposal, one bill that you're working on and focused on as the most important, what is it?
It's always defend the guard for me, because I'm a war veteran. I'm an anti-war war veteran. And for that reason, it is always my most important issue. Until that is passed and we have brought all the troops home, I will never stop being an anti-war activist.
I get that at all. I have all these regrettable tattoos I got when I was in the Army, and people ask me all the time, why don't you cover them up? I'm like, oh, they're really good reminders of what I fucked up.
Right.
But all right. So, and defend the guard's a good one. I mean, it's not one that's talked about a lot. We talk about a lot here in New Hampshire. We have quite a few National Guard members who are in our state LP, particularly Mises Caucus folks. And so it's something that we've been talking about a lot, but I don't hear it talked about ever as a national movement or as a national, or as even a libertarian focused by the National Party. It's not something that people bring up. And think tanks like Cato and the Ron Paul Institute never bring it up or mention it. So explain what your Defend the Guard bill in New Hampshire is going to do and how it's going to affect people.
Yeah, so what our Defend the Guard bill does is makes it that there has to be an actual declaration of war.
Which hasn't happened since before Korea.
In a country or the state. What was that? Oh yeah, as happened before Korea. This was the law. This is constitutional. Like the 15th Amendment to the Constitution says this. And I think it's section 14 of the Maine state constitution, 14 or 15 of the Maine state constitution says it as well, that the governor has control over the National Guard, except for in 3 instances. An insurrection, which as a libertarian, I think you have the right to be an insurrectionist against your government. That's something the founders knew as well. If there is a declaration of war, or a national emergency or a state emergency. Those are the only 3 times. But with a national emergency, that's something like a flood going on down in Louisiana. Our National Guard would be able to fly down there, provide assistance, which is why we have them in the first place. They're here to take care of their state first and then help other states with emergencies.
I remember it was my National Guard unit in Massachusetts that was the main responding force to Katrina. And the reason that the Massachusetts National Guard had to be the one to respond to New Orleans for Hurricane Katrina was because the New Orleans National Guard was busy in Iraq. The Louisiana Guard.
You see, so that should never happen again.
Right.
And in addition to the fact that we should bring all of the troops home from all of the bases, all of the combat zones, This is the step that says, look, we're drawing the line. We're telling you that you have to follow the Constitution. And since we know you're not going to go out and get an actual declaration of war, this is what we can do to put a big chink in the armor of the military industrial complex. And because, whether you like the Constitution, you hate the Constitution, I agree with Spooner on it. We have this tool that we can do something with. We just have to figure out what we can do with it. And there are enough people out there who at least give lip service to claiming to be constitutionalists and care about the Constitution, that once we start explaining these libertarian ideals to them through that lens, through the way that they understand the world, they automatically agree with us. And then you can get into your argument of how it's bupkis. But you want to engage them at their level first. And that's what we've been doing with Defend the Guard. We actually have on September 11th up here a giant Bring Our Troops Home rally where I'll be speaking and making a very special announcement at. And we've got a gentleman who last session was the one that had got the bill introduced. He got to it before I did. That lucky SOB. But anyway, colonel in the military.
I almost feel like these Defend the Guard initiatives are the inevitable conclusion of Colin Powell's reorganization when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When Colin Powell is like, I'm by no means going to call Colin Powell a libertarian or somebody libertarians should aspire to support. And he has supported some treacherous policies as Secretary of State and member of George Bush's cabinet. But when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he took a very anti-war approach to the reorganization of the United States military, where he started shifting the active duty Army and active duty Marine Corps to be combat personnel only, frontline combat personnel, infantry units, armored units, air units, and shifting all of the support forces, the cooks, the supply clerks, the maintenance units, all to the reserves. And his argument was that the president would have the power to deploy the Marines and the Army in a true emergency to defend the country, but it would take time and effort to mobilize the reserves to support them for a long-term mission. So that if something did come up and we needed the military to defend us, we had combat capability to defend us, but it would keep us from ever occupying another country or looking at things like that, because immediately after Vietnam, Colin Powell believed that there was not the political will to pull teachers out of classrooms to send them to war.
And how wrong he was.
Right. Well, I don't think he was wrong at the time. It was the invasion of Iraq. The first invasion of Iraq in the first Gulf War was over quick enough. They never needed to mobilize the reserves to support an occupation force. And when Bill Clinton sent troops into the Middle East, he didn't into Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. He found a way around it. The Clinton administration discovered these things called contractors. And that when you sent your volunteer enlisted infantrymen to go to war and protect another country, as long as you hired contractors, you weren't pulling people out of their everyday 9-to-5 jobs. You weren't pulling kids out of school, and you weren't pulling teachers out of school and doctors out of hospitals to send them to war. And it just became we had troops stationed all over the world, and we had a contractor force supplying them, and it just kind of slipped people's minds and memories. And then after 9/11, there was political will. After 9/11, there was the political will for people to see the nation go to war. And at that point, it just never ended.
Yeah, this is kind of a saying it's over now. That's really what Defend the Guard is. It's us saying it's over. Other ones I'm really excited about is our legalized nature, our decriminalization bill and legalization bill of all drugs, we're going to end our vehicle registration fees. We've got a lot of stuff that we're going to be doing. But just as kind of a personal thing, it's always going to be Defend the Guard till that's done with.
All right, and I can respect that completely. The Defend the Guard is an important one to go for, because we're seeing Biden draw down troop deployments now. Who knows how long it's going to last until they find somewhere else to send them.
Well, and I'm hoping that continues, so that when we put this in, for obvious reasons, I think we all want that to continue. But if it does, when we have the next opportunity to put this bill in, we can say, hey, The president's already drawn troops down. Why wouldn't we just put our foot in the sand and say, all right, you know what? It's already going this way. We're just going to get in line.
Yeah. I think it's important to remind people, too, that your governors have kind of always had this power.
Yes, they have.
And none of them were willing to exercise it until one of the most excited things I ever got. One of the reasons I was like, damn, I think I might vote for Trump back in 2016 was because when Donald Trump's running, he's like, we're going to build a goddamn wall. We're going to bring all the troops home from Iraq and Afghanistan. We're going to put them on the southern border. And the governor of Oregon at the time, she says, the fuck you will. And she made it very well known that she was going to refuse the deployment of the Oregon National Guard to the border. And like, seeing that happen alone might be worth voting for Trump. Like seeing a governor stand up to the president and say, no, you cannot have my troops. That alone might have been worth it.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, he didn't pull them all home like he said he was going to.
No, he did not.
For a while, he just beefed the numbers up considerably. But yeah, we have quite a bit of bills that we're working on up here, We're actually putting in a bill to make it easier for quote unquote third parties. So right now the law says that you need 5,000 people in the first year and 10,000 after the second year. Well, we're going to change that to 1,000. Just you need 1,000 registered members in your party.
Nice.
And as long as you have that, then you are a registered, qualified, can get on the ballot party. And that will give us so much more choice, both from the Libertarian Party perspective, but also we have a lot of these other small parties, the Constitutionalists. We do have a small Socialist Party, Green Party. We have these other political parties, and none of us are allowed to engage in the process. So we kind of get pushed off to the side, and then every 4 years, if we have a governor candidate, our candidate debates their candidates, and none of us get on TV. None of us have a real shot. No one knows our names. So we're trying to make some serious changes with that. And I'm happy to announce that, whoever it is that is our governor candidate will be making a top priority of a lot of these different issues that are going on.
And I mean, you would think that the powers that be would have backed up a little bit after ranked choice voting. I mean, the whole vote splitting argument's not there in Maine anymore.
Well, it is for governor. We still have it in place for governor, which is unfortunate because, we put up a good candidate, but people are uncomfortable. So they go with LePage, who was our previous governor before our current one. And if we had ranked choice voting, I feel like a lot more folks would say, you know what, LePage was all right, but I like what this libertarian is saying. I'm going to give him my first vote, and then I can vote LePage too. And it's a comfort thing for them because, they get to vote for the person they really want. And that's kind of what sold me on ranked choice voting, because at first I was just against it because it was confusing to me.
It is confusing to people. Like, here's the thing: I run a nonprofit, and I do a lot of work with a local nonprofit community center for libertarians and whatnot. And we use ranked choice voting in our local, in our community elections for our board members and whatnot. And then whenever the ranked choice voting bill in the New Hampshire State House comes up, I go and testify against it. And people are like, "What kind of fucking hypocrite are you?" I'm like, "Listen. It's the most complicated voting system we can come up with. And I trust that all the computer engineers at my social club can figure it out. I don't trust that a bunch of 18-year-old kids who dealt with public education can figure it out. And I don't trust that it won't be overwhelming for them. Plus, everywhere is different. Like when you're talking about ranked choice voting for a congressional race, a very large district with only a small handful of candidates, it kind of makes sense. When you're trying to implement it at every race possible, here in New Hampshire, we have some multi-member districts because of the way the districting is done. So sure, each state rep represents about 1,200 people, but there's one district with 11 state reps.
Wow.
You want to talk about a ranked choice voting when you have 3 parties, each putting up 11 candidates. There are more possible variations of that ballot than there are voters in the district.
So, yeah, that's ridiculous.
So it comes out to like just the logistical process of running the test ballots to make sure they all work would cost millions of dollars. So it's like, no, like I will oppose ranked choice voting till the day we get approval voting here in New Hampshire. But it does make sense in other cases. Like in Maine, it's been a great experiment. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, it works phenomenally for the city council. In Burlington, Vermont, it worked so poorly they repealed it.
Yeah, and like I said before, we only have 1.13 million people in our state. So it's not a lot for the system to handle. And especially when you break that down throughout all the towns that have to count the ballots, there's not a lot of ballots for them to be counting, whether it's president, governor, whatever it may be. So here, ranked choice voting makes sense.
Yeah, and that comes down to the unfortunate aspect of all of this is, like, I want to talk about how great your legislative activism is. Unfortunately, it doesn't translate to everywhere else, because everywhere is so much different, and everywhere's so little. Like, the discrepancies and the differences between just us as neighbors in Maine and New Hampshire is so drastic. Then you go over to Vermont, and it's another entirely different system. Massachusetts, another entirely different process and system. And I just don't understand how people can look at how we do politics so different in state to state to state and think that things like education or policing or any other government function should be different, that we should have a top-down approach from the federal government. We're essentially a balkanized country. We have 50 different laboratories of innovation. It's just the federal government tells them what they're allowed to do different and what they're allowed to try and innovate on.
Exactly. And we even saw that during COVID, where the government wasn't, like, Trump himself wasn't imposing mandates for masks or for vaccines or anything like that, except on federal property. But we saw them get very much in line with what they were saying, with what the government, the federal government and the federal agencies were saying. And yeah, a couple of states ended up walking it back, Florida, North Dakota a little bit, and Texas. But a lot of places didn't. And even once those few states that did walked it back, there were still a lot of people within those states, legislators and constituents alike, who didn't like it. They wanted the mandates in place. And it's a very odd thing to think that there are people in this country, people who live on your street, who don't think of that you're a good person, and all they know about you is you didn't want to wear a mask or get a vaccine.
Man, so, I remember once we had it was a point where we had no mandate. We had no lockdown. New Hampshire was just open. Everything was open. It was fine. Like, New Hampshire was acting like COVID didn't exist and weren't changing a damn thing. And I went out to Wells, Maine for something. Not even that far, like 20 minutes over the goddamn border. And I stopped at a gas station, and somebody started screaming at me in the parking lot and charging at me in the parking lot for pumping my gas without a mask.
Yeah, people are insane. They're absolutely insane these days. And I think part of it too, like, the real issue that we had is businesses never had the ability to institute the mandates on their own accord. So there was just this blanket policy from the government, and everybody had to follow it. And because of it, folks who don't want to wear a mask, it turned into like a real political calling cry. And they've got so many people activated who they just weren't political before. They just didn't care. But then all of a sudden they're being told they have to wear this thing on their face for something that they don't care about.
Right.
And now it's getting worse, where they're making it, they haven't done it yet, but I feel like they're going to at some point mandate vaccines, and they're going to put in some kind of tracking system. And so those are some more bills that we're working on putting in, as anti-medical surveillance bills, so that way the state's not allowed to get any of your medical reports ever. Make it so that it's illegal to have a medical tracking system in the state, so that way there's a lot of little intricacies with a bill like that, though.
Well, here's my shameless plug here for New Hampshire doing it better. We already passed those bills.
Well, good job.
But no, and my recommendation to you, if like you want to pursue things like that, you should reach out to an organization called New Hampshire Liberty Alliance. It's all volunteer organization, a bunch of libertarians and free staters that get together not just to review bills, but they draft bills too. And they were a bunch of the ones who helped put together those like anti-mask mandate bills, anti-vaccine passport bills, anti-mandatory medical status bills, and stuff like that all got passed. They've got the language already drafted.
Perfect. Those are my favorite bills.
Yeah. So, all right. So we're coming up on our hour. Harrison, is there anything else you want to leave people with before we leave?
Yeah, I'll just say, in addition to all the political activism we talked about, I do political consulting. I help, different candidates and parties raise money. So if you're looking for someone to come in and help with fundraising, if you're looking for somebody to train your teams either on how to write and lobby or on how to petition, anything like that, just reach out to me at heliosnationalconsulting@gmail.com. And then go to harrisonkemp.com. You can check out all my blogs. You can find my books. Like I said, I've got that new book, Closing Freedom, coming out soon. So you can actually pick up your pre-order a copy, get a signed copy if you want. And other than that, we're plugging away up here in Maine. So it was good to finally get on a show with you, Justin.
Hey, it was great to finally talk with you. I had a great time meeting you at PorcFest, and I hope we get to talk again soon.
Yeah, definitely.
But hey, everybody, thanks for tuning in, and we're going to catch you next time. Hey, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. As always, big shout out to our guests and our viewers for making this show worth doing. And make sure you check out the links in the description to follow up and learn more. And as always, check out our sponsored merch over on snackswag.com. I stream this show to Facebook, YouTube, and Twitch live, and everything's uploaded to Odyssey the same day. So make sure you check out our channel on these platforms and help out by liking, following, subscribing, and most of all, sharing the content with your friends. That's all for today. See you guys next time.